In less than 24 months, 8 senior officials from Russia's own Ministry of Defense, deputy ministers, directorate chiefs, logistics commanders were arrested, tried, or removed from their posts. 8, while Russia was conducting its largest military operation since World War II. Let that sink in for a moment. A nation at war, actively engaged in a conflict consuming billions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of personnel. And at the exact same moment, that nation is systematically dismantling its own defense leadership structure from the inside. This is not a rumor. This is not speculation from anonymous sources. These are documented cases, court verdicts, official announcements, confirmed arrests that stretch from May of 2024 all the way through March of 2026. The question is not whether this happened. The question is what it means. Because depending on which lens you use to read this data, you arrive at completely different conclusions. The Kremlin calls it accountability, a long overdue purge of corruption inside a ministry that had grown bloated and dishonest. Some independent analysts describe it as something structurally different, an interagency power shift, executed under the cover of anti-corruption rhetoric. Both cannot be entirely right, and neither may be telling the complete story. In this video, I am going to give you a strategic framework, not a political verdict, to read what is actually happening inside Russia's defense apparatus. We will move through 3 layers. The surface layer of official justification, the structural layer of institutional rivalry, and the deeper layer of what this pattern of behavior has historically signaled in centralized power systems. By the end, you will not have a simple answer, but you will have a far more precise set of questions, the kind that allow you to read the next development in this story before the headlines catch up. The first piece of evidence changes everything you think you know about where this started. On May 12, 2024, the Kremlin made an announcement that received surprisingly little sustained analytical attention in Western media. Sergei Shoigu, Russia's defense minister for over a decade, one of the most recognizable faces of Putin's military establishment, was removed from his position. The official statement offered no detailed explanation. Shoigu was reassigned to head Russia's Security Council, a lateral move on paper. A demotion in everything that actually matters. That single event is the fault line. Everything that followed runs directly from it. 2 days later, Yuri Kuznetsov, who led the Defense Ministry's main personnel directorate, was arrested. Russian authorities announced that approximately $1 million in cash and valuables had been discovered during a search of his home, described as a bribe received from a commercial entity in exchange for an unspecified favor. The charges were real. The details were notably vague. To this day, no final verdict in his case has been made public. The pattern had begun. Vadim Shamarin, the Defense Ministry's communications director, was next. Authorities alleged he had accepted bribes totaling close to $450,000 between 2019 and 2023 payments linked to a factory that manufactured communications equipment and subsequently received large state contracts. In April of 2025, Shamarin was sentenced to 7 years in prison. Dmitry Bulgarkov followed, a former deputy defense minister who had overseen Russian military logistics for 15 years. Bulgarkov had actually been fired from his post back in September of 2022, making him one of the earliest targets, though his formal arrest did not come until July of 2024. He was placed in Lefortovo prison. No verdict has been publicly announced since. Then came Vladimir Chester, director of the Defense Ministry's main directorate for innovation, sentenced to 6 years in prison in July of 2025 on charges of fraud and embezzlement. Timur Ivanov, another deputy defense minister, received 13 years convicted on charges of bribery and embezzlement. And most recently, Ruslan Sokolov, who had also served as deputy defense minister, was formally charged in March of 2026 with embezzlement and money laundering. His case is ongoing. Then there is Pavel Popov, 19 years, handed down in April of 2024 by a military court. The charges included corruption, fraud, illegal arms possession, bribery, and abuse of power. His case became the most publicly visible in the series, and the one that finally forced the question into mainstream analytical circles. Now step back and look at the full picture. 8 senior officials, all removed, arrested, sentenced, or charged within a window of less than 24 months. Every single one of them served under Sergei Shoigu during his tenure as defense minister. This is not a coincidence of timing. This is a data pattern. And here is what makes that pattern significant beyond the individual cases. Several of these men were holding positions and presumably engaging in the very behaviors they were later prosecuted for years before any charges were brought. The corruption, if it existed as described, did not begin in 2024. The prosecutions did. The Kremlin's position is consistent and clear. This is institutional accountability, a necessary cleansing of a ministry that had allowed misconduct to accumulate unchecked. That explanation is not impossible. Russia's defense procurement system has been widely documented as structurally vulnerable to exactly this kind of insider corruption, including by Russian state audit bodies themselves. But the explanation contains a gap that the official narrative does not close. If the misconduct had been ongoing for years, why did accountability arrive in a concentrated burst, targeting one specific network of officials at the precise moment that network's patron lost his position? That gap is where the analysis gets genuinely complex, and that is exactly where we are going next. To read this purge correctly, you cannot look at it as a single event with a single cause. What the data shows is 3 distinct forces operating simultaneously, each with its own logic, its own beneficiaries, and its own timeline. They overlap. They reinforce each other. And together, they produce an outcome that none of them individually fully explains. Let us move through each one. John Hardy, Deputy Director of the Russia Program at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, has pointed to something that most surface-level coverage misses entirely. The arrests targeting Shoigu's network were not initiated by the Defense Ministry itself. They were driven by the FSB, Russia's Federal Security Service, the domestic intelligence apparatus, an entirely separate institutional power center. Think about what that means structurally. One of Russia's most powerful agencies is conducting criminal investigations into the leadership of another of Russia's most powerful agencies. And it is doing so with the explicit authorization of the Kremlin. This is not unprecedented in Russian institutional history. Observers who have tracked the relationship between Russia's security services over the past 3 decades consistently note a recurring pattern. In periods of strategic stress, the agency closest to the executive uses legal mechanisms to subordinate rival institutions. The FSB is not simply enforcing the law here. According to Hardy's analysis, it is consolidating terrain. Consider the specific timing. Shoigu had reportedly been critical of Russia's defense industry for failing to supply the military with adequate equipment and resources. That criticism, directed at sectors with close ties to other parts of the security establishment, created friction. According to Hardy, the FSB, which bore its own share of responsibility for failures in the early phase of the Ukraine operation, appears to have successfully redirected the institutional blame before it could redirect itself toward them. In other words, the agency that moved first won the first round. Now, here is the counter-argument, and it deserves serious weight. A number of Russian analysts, including voices within the exile community who have no reason to defend the Kremlin's framing, argue that the defense ministry's corruption was genuine, documented, and severe. That procurement fraud, ghost contracts, and systemic theft from military budgets were not fabricated charges, but operational realities that directly degraded Russia's military effectiveness. From this perspective, the FSB's involvement reflects not a power grab, but a functional necessity, using the one institution capable of investigating another without being obstructed by it. Both readings are analytically defensible. The data does not allow us to fully resolve them. The Center for European Policy Analysis has documented something structurally important about how loyalty functions inside Russia's governing system. Financial accumulation by senior officials is not an aberration. It is, according to SEPA's analysis, a mechanism through which the center maintains the loyalty of its periphery. Officials are permitted to enrich themselves. That enrichment becomes both a reward and a leash. The system works as long as the center chooses not to pull the leash. What the Defense Ministry prosecutions reveal is the moment the leash was pulled. And the critical analytical observation is this. The same behavior that was tolerated for years became prosecutable the moment its political utility shifted. This is not a new mechanism in centralized governance systems. Historians who study Soviet-era institutional dynamics have noted that the distinction between a loyal official and a criminal was often not a matter of conduct. It was a matter of whether the center still needed them. The conduct remained constant. The political calculus changed. What SEPA's framework suggests is that we should read the timing of these prosecutions not as a discovery of wrongdoing, but as a decision to activate pre-existing leverage. The evidence was likely always available. The question was always when and against whom to use it. This matters because it tells us something about the current system's underlying fragility. A governance structure that uses permitted corruption as its primary loyalty mechanism is permanently vulnerable to the moment that mechanism reverses. Every official who enriched themselves with institutional tolerance now operates with the knowledge that their enrichment is simultaneously their exposure. That is not stability. That is a system held in tension. The third force is the one most directly connected to the battlefield and the one with the most visible domestic political dimension. Russia's military operation in Ukraine has extended far beyond any publicly stated initial timeline. The partial mobilization announced in September of 2022 was politically costly and deeply unpopular across significant portions of the Russian population. Casualty figures, while not officially disclosed in full, have been independently estimated by multiple research institutions at levels that generate sustained domestic pressure. When a military operation produces outcomes that diverge significantly from stated expectations, centralized political systems face a structural problem. Accountability must be assigned somewhere. The question is never whether someone will be held responsible. The question is who. Historical pattern observation is relevant here. In the 1930s, Stalin's purge of the Red Army's senior officer corps, including figures like Marshal Tukhachevsky, was widely analyzed at the time and since as militarily self-destructive. And in narrow operational terms, it was. The Red Army entered the Second World War with a dramatically weakened command structure as a direct result. But from the perspective of internal political consolidation, it achieved its objective, absolute subordination of the military institution to the political center. We are not drawing a direct equivalence to the current situation. The scale, the context, and the mechanisms are different. But the underlying structural logic using institutional purges to resolve the tension between military underperformance and political authority is a pattern that analysts who study centralized power systems have flagged as relevant to the current moment. The Kremlin's official position, stated consistently, is that Russia's military operation is proceeding according to plan and that these prosecutions reflect normal institutional accountability. That position is part of the public record and should be represented as such. What independent strategic analysts are examining is the gap between that framing and the observable concentration of prosecutions within a single institutional network over a compressed time frame following a specific personnel change at the top. Three forces: institutional rivalry, the reversal of controlled corruption, the accountability deficit of prolonged conflict. None of them alone closes the analytical question. Together, they produce something more unsettling than a simple explanation would. Because when you map these three forces onto each other, a fourth question emerges, one that almost no mainstream coverage has directly addressed. What happens to the officials who replace the ones now sitting in Lefortovo? What behavioral logic governs a leadership class that watched its predecessors prosecuted for conduct the system previously rewarded? That question connects directly to something you can measure, something that reaches well beyond Moscow. And that is exactly where we go next. Here is the question that most geopolitical analysis stops short of asking. What does a destabilized military command structure in Moscow actually cost someone who has never set foot in Russia? The answer is more concrete than most people expect. And it moves through a chain of consequences that is neither speculative nor distant. It is already in motion. When a military institution undergoes significant leadership turnover during active operations, the immediate operational risk is not collapse. Institutions are more durable than their personnel. The immediate risk is something subtler and more dangerous: miscalculation. Historians of international security have documented this pattern repeatedly. During the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, the most acute danger was never a deliberate decision to escalate. It was the possibility that fragmented chains of command, operating under extreme pressure with incomplete information, would produce an action that neither side had authorized. The crisis came within hours of exactly that outcome, not because of intent, but because of institutional breakdown at the operational level. The relevance here is structural, not equivalent. A defense ministry that has cycled through multiple deputy ministers, communications directors, and logistics chiefs within a 24-month window is, by definition, operating with reduced institutional memory and established protocol. New appointees inherit positions without the relationships, the informal networks, or the accumulated operational knowledge of their predecessors. Analysts at institutions, including the International Institute for Strategic Studies, have flagged command continuity as a variable that meaningfully affects escalation risk in prolonged conflicts. This is not alarmism. It is a measurable structural condition, and escalation risk, even as a probability rather than a certainty, has a price. Markets price it. Energy markets price it first. Russia remains one of the world's largest producers and exporters of hydrocarbons. That fact has not changed. What has changed since February of 2022 is the routing, the pricing, and the counterparty risk associated with Russian energy flows, shifts extensively documented by the International Energy Agency across its 2023 through 2025 reporting cycles. The mechanism works as follows. Uncertainty about the trajectory of the conflict in Ukraine, its duration, its potential for geographic expansion, its endpoint conditions directly feeds into the risk calculations of energy traders, infrastructure planners, and sovereign wealth managers. When that uncertainty increases, as it does during periods of visible internal instability within Russia's defense establishment, the risk premium embedded in energy pricing adjusts accordingly. That adjustment does not stay in the trading terminal. It moves downstream. It moves into shipping costs, into the operational margins of manufacturers who depend on energy-intensive production processes, into the logistics costs of supply chains that are already operating under compression from the structural disruptions of the previous 3 years. And at the end of that chain, at the point where all of those accumulated cost pressures finally land, it moves into the price of goods on a shelf. Inflation, in this transmission model, is not an abstraction. It is the arithmetic of geopolitical instability converted into a number on a receipt. There is a third consequence that receives almost no attention in standard coverage, and it may be the most consequential of the three for medium-term outcomes. Consider the position of every official who now occupies a role previously held by someone sitting in Lefortovo prison. They were appointed into a system that prosecuted their predecessors for behavior the system had previously permitted. They have no reliable way to distinguish which of their own current actions fall within the zone of tolerance and which fall within the zone of future prosecution. That uncertainty does not produce bold, operationally effective leadership. It produces the opposite. It produces officials who defer upward on every significant decision, who avoid committing resources without explicit authorization, and who prioritize personal legal insulation over operational effectiveness. This behavioral pattern, sometimes called institutional risk aversion, under ambiguous authority, has been documented in organizational research across both military and civilian contexts. It is not unique to Russia, but it is particularly costly inside a military institution conducting active operations that require decentralized initiative and rapid adaptive decision-making at the command level. The irony embedded in this dynamic is one that strategic analysts have begun to note carefully. A purge designed to increase control may be systematically reducing the operational capacity of the institution it was meant to discipline. That tension between political consolidation and military effectiveness is the unresolved core of everything we have covered today, and it leads directly to the question that no one inside the Kremlin and very few outside it has yet answered convincingly. Let us be precise about what this analysis has established and what it has not. What is documented and verifiable? 8 senior officials from Russia's defense ministry, all connected to Sergei Shoigu's network, were removed, arrested, or sentenced within a compressed 24-month window. The legal proceedings are real. The personnel disruption is real. The institutional concentration of these cases within a single political network is real. What remains analytically open, the primary intent driving these prosecutions, whether the dominant logic is genuine anti-corruption enforcement, FSB institutional expansion, political scapegoating for military underperformance, or some weighted combination of all three, the available evidence does not allow a definitive conclusion. Anyone telling you otherwise is selling you certainty that the data does not support. And that unresolved question is precisely what makes the next development in this story critical to watch. Because the officials now sitting in those vacated positions are making decisions today. Decisions about logistics, communications, resource allocation, and operational planning under a behavioral framework shaped entirely by what happened to the people they replaced. The real question, the one that will determine whether this purge strengthens or quietly hollows out Russia's military capacity over the next 18 to 36 months, is whether the new leadership class performs or freezes. We do not yet have the answer, but the data points are accumulating. If you want to continue tracking this through the lens of structure and evidence rather than ideology, subscribe and stay close. The next piece of this story is already moving.